The person whose technique helped make large-scale vanilla cultivation possible outside Mexico could not legally own his own labor. In 1841, on the French colony of Reunion, Edmond Albius was about 12 years old and enslaved. European planters had already carried vanilla vines across the ocean. The plants survived. They climbed. They flowered. Then the blossoms fell without producing the valuable pods the planters wanted. Edmond took a narrow sliver of bamboo and lifted a tiny membrane inside one flower. With his thumb, he pressed its reproductive parts together. The movement lasted only seconds. It was simple enough to repeat across an entire plantation. That small gesture helped break vanilla's dependence on its native Mexican environment. The orchid could now produce commercial harvests on colonial land thousands of miles away, but the boy who developed the method lived inside a system designed to take value from his knowledge without giving him power over what followed. Today, vanilla is so familiar that its name means ordinary, but there was nothing ordinary about the flower, the discovery, or the world that turned it into a global flavor. So who had to disappear from vanilla's story before the rest of us could call it plain? Vanilla became so familiar that its name eventually came to mean the absence of surprise. In a modern ice cream plant, a worker can pour a measured amount of vanilla flavor into a steel vat large enough to fill thousands of cartons. The liquid disappears into milk, sugar, and air. No orchid is visible. No pod needs to be cut open. By the end of the shift, the same gentle aroma will exist in freezers across an entire region, identical from one package to the next. That consistency has changed the meaning of the word itself. A vanilla option is the safe option. A vanilla design is the basic design. In conversation, vanilla can describe something ordinary, predictable, even dull. The plant behind that word is none of those things. Vanilla is produced by an orchid. The long dark objects sold as vanilla beans are not beans at all, but cured fruits filled with tiny seeds. Before curing, the green fruit does not release the deep, sweet aroma that consumers recognize. That character develops only after harvesting, when the pods are heated or blanched, sweated, slowly dried, and conditioned over weeks or months. In a bakery kitchen, the difference is visible. A cook places one cured pod on a wooden board, cuts it lengthwise, and draws the back of a knife through its interior. A black, sticky mass gathers on the blade. Those tiny seeds may later appear as dark specks in custard or ice cream, visual proof that a real fruit entered the recipe. A few feet away, a bottle offers the same general promise, in a far easier form. Even the words on that bottle carry legal and chemical distinctions. In the United States, a product called vanilla extract must draw its flavoring principles from cured vanilla beans and contain at least 35% alcohol by volume. Other products may combine vanilla with added vanillin, while imitation flavors can reproduce the most recognizable part of the aroma without relying on cured vanilla fruit in the same way. That recognizable molecule is vanillin. It is central to the scent people identify as vanilla, but a natural cured pod contains a far more complicated bouquet. More than 200 compounds may contribute to its aroma. The bean offers smoke, wood, spice, flowers, fruit, and warmth in proportions that change with species, soil, curing, and storage. Industrial flavoring can reproduce a clear signal. The orchid produces a crowd of signals at once. The flower is equally demanding. A vanilla blossom opens briefly, often for less than a day. If pollination does not happen during that window, the flower falls without forming a fruit. Outside the plant's native range, commercial growers commonly pollinate each blossom by hand. One flower, one movement, one possible pod. Then comes the wait. The fruit remains on the vine for months. After harvest, it must be transformed again before it smells like the ingredient printed on a carton. Nothing about this process is plain. It is slow, delicate, labor-intensive, and biologically uncertain. Yet the final flavor became a symbol of effortlessness. That reversal is the first clue to vanilla's larger history. The modern world did not make the orchid simple. It built ways to keep the difficulty away from the person tasting it. To understand how that happened, the story has to begin before laboratories, factories, or European dessert tables under the humid forest canopy of Mexico where vanilla was already known long before Europe learned its name. Europe did not discover vanilla. It entered a story that was already old. Long before the flavor appeared in European kitchens, vanilla grew in the humid forests of Mesoamerica. The vine climbed living trees, reaching through shade toward filtered light. Its roots gripped bark and soil. Its flowers opened briefly. Its fruit took months to mature. This was not an ingredient waiting to be found. It already belonged to a landscape, and to people who understood how to live with it. In the region now called Veracruz, especially in Totonacapan, vanilla became closely associated with Totonac communities. Later, accounts often describe the Totonacs as the first people to cultivate it. The exact beginning of cultivation is harder to prove. Wild collection, deliberate tending, transplantation, and full domestication do not leave the same evidence. But there is no doubt that indigenous knowledge shaped the way the plant was recognized, managed, and used long before Europeans entered the trade. Under the forest canopy, a grower could not treat vanilla like wheat in an open field. The vine needed support. Too much sun could damage it. Too much water could rot it. Too little shade or moisture could stop it from thriving. A useful plant had to be read within its surroundings. Imagine a cultivator moving slowly beneath the trees after rain. He lifts one vine from a trunk, checks the swelling green fruit, and leaves it in place. The pod has almost none of the rich aroma that will later make it valuable. Harvesting it is only one step. The scent must still be drawn out through knowledge, timing, and treatment. Vanilla also entered wider Mesoamerican networks of exchange and power. By the 15th century, the Mexica, commonly called the Aztecs, used vanilla to flavor cacao drinks. These were not the sweet milk chocolates of the modern world. Cacao could be ground with water, maize, chile, flowers, or other aromatics, then poured from one vessel to another to build a layer of foam. In a palace, market, or elite household, a servant grinds cacao on a stone surface. The paste darkens beneath the hand. Vanilla is added not as a sugary dessert note, but as one element in a bitter, spiced, carefully prepared drink. That scene matters because it overturns the familiar order of the story. Vanilla did not become meaningful when Europeans tasted it. Europeans encountered it after it had already acquired cultural, culinary, and economic value. When Spanish forces entered the Aztec world in the early 16th century, they entered existing systems of tribute, farming, trade, and consumption. Cacao and vanilla were drawn into a new imperial network. American products crossed the Atlantic. European courts and merchants began attaching new prices and meanings to them. The popular version often compresses this transformation into a single heroic sentence. Hernán Cortés discovered vanilla and brought it to Europe. That sentence is convenient. It is also misleading. Cortés and other Spaniards helped connect Mesoamerican goods to European markets, but they did not create the knowledge inside those goods. They did not invent the use of vanilla. They did not discover an empty landscape. They encountered communities already cultivating, trading, preparing, and interpreting the plant. Once vanilla reached Europe, it was first closely associated with cacao. To European consumers, the two arrived wrapped together in stories of conquest, luxury, and distant lands. Vanilla became an exotic flavor at elite tables, while the people who had known the plant longest became less visible in the story told about it. This was the first major separation in vanilla's history. The plant remained rooted in American ecology, but its commercial identity was being rewritten elsewhere. Its value could now be discussed in royal kitchens, merchant offices, and botanical collections without the full history of Totonacapan entering the room. For a time, that distance gave Mexico a practical advantage. Europe could import cured pods. It could admire the aroma. It could raise the price. But as long as vanilla production remained tied to its original environment and inherited knowledge, European powers remained buyers. They wanted to become owners. The next step was to take the vine itself across the ocean and make it produce wherever empire chose to plant it. Europe could carry the vine across an ocean. It could not command the flower to make fruit. By the early 19th century, vanilla had become valuable enough for colonial powers to want more than imported pods. Buying from Mexico meant accepting distance, limited supply, and dependence on land they did not fully control. The more profitable solution was familiar. Move the plant into territory already governed by empire. Cuttings traveled to botanical gardens and tropical colonies. On Bourbon Island, now Réunion, a French possession east of Madagascar, planters tried to establish the orchid in soil that appeared warm and humid enough to support it. The vine survived. It climbed. It produced pale flowers. Then the flowers fell. A planter could stand beneath a healthy mass of green leaves and still have nothing to export. The plant looked productive, yet the valuable fruit never appeared. A ship could transport roots, stems, and leaves. It could not carry every relationship that had surrounded the orchid in Mexico. The obstacle was hidden inside the blossom. Vanilla flowers contain both male and female reproductive structures, but a thin flap of tissue called the rostellum separates them. Pollen does not simply fall into place. Something must lift or push that barrier aside and bring the parts together. In vanilla's native range, local insects can perform that work. For years, the story was reduced to a single supposed pollinator, often identified as a Melipona bee. Later research showed that account was too neat. Bees in the Euleima genus have also been associated with the plant, and the exact ecology is more complicated than the legend of one bee holding the only key. For colonial planters, the biological details mattered less than the result. Outside Mexico, flowers appeared without pods. Every failed bloom preserved Mexico's practical advantage. Imagine a morning in a plantation garden on Bourbon. A worker notices a fresh flower and marks the vine. By afternoon, the blossom is beginning to close. Days later, it drops. No green fruit forms behind it. The same failure repeats across the garden, while merchants in Europe continue paying high prices for cured pods arriving from the Americas. Botanists tried to solve the problem. In the 1830s, the Belgian botanist Charles-François Antoine Morin studied how vanilla flowers were pollinated. He observed the structure of the blossom, reproduced pollination by hand, and published an account in 1837. His work demonstrated that human intervention could make the orchid bear fruit outside its native habitat. Scientifically, that was a breakthrough. Commercially, it was not yet enough. Morin's technique belonged to the careful world of botanical observation and greenhouse experimentation. It was delicate and cumbersome. A method that succeeded on a few protected flowers did not automatically become a method that plantation workers could repeat quickly across thousands of vines during a narrow morning window. In a European greenhouse, a botanist could lean over one flower with instruments and time. On a colonial estate, laborers would need to find every blossom that had opened, fertilize it before it closed, and move immediately to the next one. The difference between those settings was the difference between proving that something could be done and building an industry around it. That distinction exposed the limits of imperial power. European states could claim islands, command ships, establish gardens, and transfer plants across continents. But ownership of the vine did not guarantee control of its reproduction. For a time, vanilla remained a crop that resisted relocation. The empire possessed the specimen but not the harvest. Then, in 1841, on the same island where planters had watched flowers fall without fruit, a 12-year-old enslaved boy looked inside the blossom and found a faster way. His name was Edmond. The solution empire needed came from a child the colony treated as property. Edmond was born on Bourbon Island in 1829. His mother died during childbirth, and he entered life inside a colonial society that recorded him as property. He was taken into the household of Feriol Bellier Beaumont, a landowner with an interest in plants, where the boy learned to observe gardens closely. That background does not turn his discovery into a gift from his enslaver. It makes the contradiction sharper. Edmond acquired botanical knowledge in a world that denied him control over his own body, labor, and future. In 1841, Bellier Beaumont's vanilla vines were healthy, but largely fruitless. One morning, Edmond led him to the plants and pointed to two developing pods. According to the account later associated with the discovery, the owner doubted that the boy had produced them. Edmond then demonstrated what he had done. The flower was small enough to hold in one hand. With the other, Edmond used a thin sliver of bamboo, a blade of grass, or a similarly narrow point to lift the rostellum, the flap separating the pollen-bearing anther from the receptive stigma. Then he pressed the two parts together with his thumb. Lift, press, move on. The gesture took only seconds. Charles Morin had already shown in Europe that vanilla could be fertilized by hand. Edmond's achievement was different. His method was quick, simple, and practical enough to be repeated across a field. It did not require a botanist standing over one protected specimen with elaborate instruments. A worker could learn it, inspect rows of vines, and pollinate flower after flower during the short period when each blossom remained open. Imagine the first successful fruit beginning to lengthen behind the fading flower. For years, blossoms on bourbon had opened and fallen without leaving anything valuable behind. Now, a narrow green pod remained attached to the vine. That pod was proof. Edmond had transformed an observation about flower anatomy into a system of work. The orchid no longer had to wait for a pollinator from its native ecosystem. Human labor could carry out the task wherever the vine could be grown. The method spread beyond Bellier-Beaumont's garden. Historical records later described Edmond being sent to other estates to demonstrate the technique directly. On each property, the lesson would have been almost absurdly brief. Find the flower that had opened that morning, raise the barrier, bring pollen and stigma together, and continue before the opportunity closed. The knowledge moved from estate to estate. Its creator did not move through the world with the same freedom. Edmond was still enslaved. Under the law of the colony, his skill could increase the value of land, vines, and exports, without giving him the legal power to claim the industry growing from it. The planters could reproduce his gesture thousands of times. Edmond could not convert authorship into ownership. His contribution was also challenged. Jean-Michel Claude Richard, a prominent botanist on the island, later claimed that he had previously taught the method. Bellier-Beaumont defended Edmond, arguing that the boy had developed the practical technique himself. The dispute reveals more than professional jealousy. In a colonial society structured by race and slavery, many people found it easier to imagine that an established European botanist had produced the breakthrough than to credit an enslaved child. The surviving historical record is not perfectly clean. Morin had achieved artificial pollination before Edmond. Other people had studied the flower. But the commercially useful gesture that spread from Réunion in 1841 is associated with Edmond Albius, and modern historical and botanical accounts recognize the distinction. That distinction matters. Edmond did not create the vanilla orchid. He did not originate the plant's indigenous history, and he was not the first human ever to interfere with its pollination. What he did was solve the specific problem colonial growers had failed to solve: how to fertilize the flower fast enough, simply enough, and reliably enough to build production beyond Mexico. A child found the point where biology could be turned into routine labor. The plantation owners saw pods. Merchants would soon see exports. Edmond had opened the flower. The colonial economy was about to close around the discovery. More than a century and a half later, commercial growers would still recognize the movement by a name that preserved its origin: Edmond's gesture. The flower had been opened. Now, the market moved in. After 1841, plantation managers converted Edmond's technique into a timetable. Overseers tracked flowering vines, assigned rows, and expected every new bloom to be treated during its narrow window. The breakthrough did not make vanilla easy. It made the difficulty measurable, schedulable, and expandable. The crop still demanded months of attention. Mature green fruit carried little of the fragrance buyers expected. It had to be harvested at the correct stage and cured through a sequence that varied by region, but required close judgment. Workers plunged or heated the pods to stop their ordinary ripening. They wrapped them to sweat in their own warmth. They laid them in the sun, gathered them before night, dried them slowly in shade, sorted them, and stored them for conditioning. The process could continue for months. Too much moisture invited mold. Too much heat damaged the aroma. A harvest could survive the vine and still lose value in the curing house. Inside one of those buildings, a worker opens a cloth bundle. The green pods have begun to darken. A sweet smell rises, faint at first, then richer. The aroma that Europe treated as the natural property of the plant was being created through repeated judgment, handling, and time. Production on Reunion climbed dramatically. In 1858, the island sent roughly 2 tons of vanilla to France. By 1867, the figure had reached about 20 tons. By 1898, exports were reported at approximately 200 tons. A crop that had once refused to fruit outside the Americas had become one of the island's celebrated products. The numbers grew because Edmond's technique could be organized across entire estates. His reward did not grow with them. France abolished slavery in its colonies in 1848, and Edmond became legally free. But emancipation did not transfer to him a share of the wealth his method was producing. Former slaveholders received state compensation for the loss of people they had claimed as property. Edmond received no equivalent payment for the discovery that increased the value of colonial estates. Supporters later tried to obtain recognition or assistance for him. The requests did not create lasting security. He worked for wages, returned to agricultural labor, and died in 1,880 inches poverty. The contrast is difficult to avoid. By the end of the century, crates of vanilla left Reunion carrying a product whose commercial expansion depended on his technique. Edmond himself did not occupy the merchant offices where prices were agreed, the ships where cargo was insured, or the European shops where vanilla was sold as luxury. The industry preserved the technique more effectively than it protected the man. It also carried that technique farther across the Indian Ocean. Under French colonial expansion, vanilla cultivation spread into Madagascar and neighboring islands. Growers no longer needed the ecology of Mexico to make the plant bear fruit. They needed vines, suitable tropical conditions, and enough labor to meet the flowering schedule. The center of production began to shift again. On a plantation in Madagascar, supervisors could divide rows, count successful flowers, and record expected pods. The plant had traveled from the Americas. The method had traveled from Reunion. The labor was assigned to new communities. This was Empire's real harvest. It did not merely export pods. It took a practical piece of knowledge, detached it from its creator, standardized it, and placed it wherever land and labor could be organized around profit. Yet, even this system had limits. Natural vanilla remained slow. Every pod still depended on a brief flowering window, months on the vine, and more months of curing. Weather could reduce the crop. Mold could spoil it. Skilled work could not be compressed indefinitely without damaging quality. For a growing food industry, that was still too much uncertainty. The next attempt to make vanilla cheaper would not ask plantations to produce more pods. It would ask chemists to identify which part of vanilla's aroma could be separated from the orchid entirely. The next revolution in vanilla did not happen in a field. It happened in a laboratory. In 1858, the French chemist Théodore Nicolas Goblet evaporated vanilla extract and recovered pale crystals from what remained. The substance was vanillin, the compound that gives cured vanilla much of its most recognizable aroma. For the first time, one of vanilla's central signals could be separated from the dark pod and examined on its own. Natural vanilla was still more complicated than a single molecule. Its aroma came from a mixture of compounds shaped by the orchid, the place where it grew, and the way its fruit had been cured. But vanillin carried the part of the scent that most people could identify immediately. That made it valuable far beyond botany. In 1874, the German chemists Orchid and Wilhelm Hamann determined vanillin's chemical structure and synthesized it from coniferin, a substance associated with conifer wood. Hamann soon established a factory in Holzminden, Germany, to produce the new flavoring on an industrial scale. Place a cured vanilla pod beside a sample of vanillin, and the transformation becomes visible. The pod is black, wrinkled, moist, and irregular. It represents a flower pollinated by hand, months of growth on a vine, careful harvesting, and a long curing process. The vanillin appears as light-colored crystals. It can be weighed, dissolved, transported, and repeated according to a formula. One belongs to a crop. The other belongs to a manufacturing system. Early synthetic production did not instantly replace natural vanilla. Consumers had to be persuaded that a laboratory-made aroma belonged in food, Manufacturers had to learn how much to use and how it behaved in chocolate, baked goods, medicines, perfumes, and drinks. But the commercial advantage was obvious. A factory did not need to wait for thousands of orchids to flower. It did not lose an entire crop to a storm. It could produce a recognizable vanilla note with far greater consistency and at a cost that natural pods could not easily match. Industrial methods changed over time. Early production began with coniferin. By the 1930s, North American manufacturers were also extracting vanillin from lignin-rich waste created during sulfite paper pulping. Modern processes later relied heavily on other chemical feedstocks, especially guaiacol. A scent once tied to a tropical orchid could now emerge from wood chemistry, paper mill residue, or an industrial reactor. This did not mean that synthetic vanillin was chemically imaginary. A vanillin molecule does not remember whether it came from an orchid, wood, or a factory process. The difference lies in everything surrounding it. A cured pod contains a wider aromatic mixture. Industrial vanillin isolates and amplifies one dominant message. For mass production, one clear message was often enough. Inside a 20th century food factory, a technician weighs a small quantity of white powder. The number on the scale matters more than the weather in Madagascar or the number of flowers that opened that morning. The powder enters a mixer. Soon the same aroma will appear in biscuits, ice cream, custard, soft drinks, and medicine made in quantities no plantation could supply pod for pod. The industry had not reproduced the whole orchid. It had reproduced recognition. That distinction helped turn vanilla into a default flavor. Manufacturers could make it mild, stable, and familiar. Consumers encountered the same basic signal again and again until it no longer suggested rarity. It suggested normality. The word vanilla began to describe an experience larger than the crop itself. It could refer to an extract made from cured pods, a flavor built around industrial vanillin, or simply the idea of sweetness without risk. Chemistry had separated the flavor from the limits of land and season, but it did not make natural vanilla unnecessary. It changed what natural vanilla meant. The real pods could now be sold as complex, authentic, premium, and scarce the opposite of the industrial flavor that carried their name into everyday life. That created a divided market. One form of vanilla could be produced reliably in factories. The other still depended on farmers moving through fields flower by flower, then waiting through months of growth and curing. The laboratory had made vanilla available to almost everyone. It had also made the people producing the orchid easier to forget, until a storm, a theft, or a price shock in Madagascar reminded the market how fragile natural vanilla remained. Vanilla became cheap everywhere except where real vanilla was being grown. Before sunrise in northeastern Madagascar, a farming family moves between vines with baskets and thin wooden tools. The flowers that opened that morning will not wait. Each one must be found and pollinated before it closes. The work is precise, repetitive, and almost impossible to postpone. For months afterward, the family carries the risk. A cyclone can flatten shade trees and tear vines from their supports. Heavy rain can encourage disease. A thief can remove green pods in a single night. A buyer can arrive after harvest and offer a price far below what the farmer expected when the crop was pollinated. None of those risks appears on a label that says Madagascar vanilla. Madagascar became one of the world's most important sources of natural vanilla because it combined a suitable climate with generations of skilled labor. But importance did not give small farmers control over the market. Their crop passed through collectors, processors, exporters, flavor houses, and food companies before reaching consumers. The farther the pods traveled, the more people gained influence over quality, timing, and price. When prices rose sharply, vanilla became valuable enough to attract theft. Some growers harvested pods too early rather than risk losing them. Others pressed identifying marks into green fruit, so stolen pods could be recognized at a local market. Picture a farmer moving down a row with a homemade stamp. He presses a code into one pod, then another. The mark adds no aroma. It exists because the fruit has become valuable before the person growing it has been paid. Early harvesting creates another trap. Immature pods develop weaker aroma and do not cure as well. Lower quality can depress future prices, punishing growers who waited for proper maturity, along with those who did not. Then the cycle reverses. High prices encourage expanded planting and stockpiling. Food companies reduce their use of natural vanilla or reformulate with cheaper flavoring. Supply accumulates. Prices fall. The crop that looked like a path out of poverty becomes difficult to sell at a profit. A 2024 Fairtrade study of vanilla households in Madagascar's Sava region captured that reversal. It estimated that the average farm gate price for a kilogram of green vanilla fell from about €36 in 2018 to roughly €1.60 in 2023, excluding certification premiums of about €1 per kilogram. Almost all surveyed vanilla farmers recorded a negative cash balance from the crop in 2023. The flower had not become easier to pollinate. The pods had not become faster to cure. Only the price had collapsed. In a storage room, cured bundles remain stacked while a farmer waits for a buyer. Petrol, medicine, school costs, and transport still require cash. The pods may contain months of work, but they cannot pay for anything until someone farther along the chain agrees to take them. World Bank reporting on Madagascar described export weakness amid lower prices for major cash crops, including vanilla. This is commodity dependence from the farm. Decisions made by governments, exporters, and international buyers can alter the value of work already completed. Poverty also changes who works. The United States Department of Labor continues to list vanilla from Madagascar as a good associated with child labor. That does not mean every vanilla farm uses children illegally, nor does it make every family task equivalent to exploitation. It means the risk is documented strongly enough that companies cannot treat traceability as optional. The language of premium products often suggests the opposite. Packages promise pure, natural, single origin, or Madagascar vanilla. Those words can identify a real agricultural product and distinguish it from synthetic vanillin. They can also create a comforting image of authenticity without explaining the price paid at the farm, the age of the worker, or the intermediaries between the vine and the shelf. Natural vanilla is not automatically ethical because it comes from a plant. Synthetic vanillin is not automatically harmful because it comes from a factory. Industrial flavoring makes vanilla affordable and reduces the land and labor required to supply global demand. Natural vanilla preserves a complex flavor, a specialized crop, and income for farming communities. The problem begins when consumers are sold the romance of the orchid, while producers absorb nearly all the instability. At one end of the chain, a family races against a flower that will close by afternoon. At the other, a shopper chooses between bottles under steady supermarket light. The label may name Madagascar. It rarely explains how little naming a place can reveal about who holds power there. Vanilla's colonial history did not disappear when colonial rule ended. The flags changed. Control moved into prices, contracts, quality standards, export rules, and the ability to wait while someone else urgently needed to sell. The orchid is still pollinated one flower at a time. The market is not. Tomorrow, vanilla will still look harmless. It may appear as a pale scoop of ice cream, a dark liquid in a small bottle, or a few black specks scattered through custard. The label will be neat. The flavor will be familiar. Nothing about it will announce the forest in Mexico, the gardens of Reunion, the laboratory in Germany, or the fields of Madagascar. But all of those places remain inside the story. Vanilla began as a living relationship between an orchid, a landscape, and the people who knew how to use it. Empire moved the vine across oceans, but the flower resisted. Then Edmond Albius opened it, with a sliver of bamboo in his thumb. That movement lasted only seconds. Its consequences lasted for generations. Planters turned the gesture into routine labor. Merchants turned the pods into exports. Chemists separated vanillin from the fruit. Factories learned to reproduce the scent without waiting for an orchid to bloom. And consumers learned to expect the same flavor at the same price. Every time. Each step made vanilla easier to buy. Each step also moved part of its history farther away. Today, One form of vanilla begins in a factory. Another still begins before sunrise, when a farmer walks between vines searching for flowers that will close within hours. Both may end in the same kitchen. Only one carries months of agricultural risk, hand pollination, curing, theft, storms, and unstable prices. That does not make every natural product virtuous or every synthetic flavor false. The real divide is not between purity and imitation. It is between what the consumer can see and what the product allows them to forget. In 1841, one hand reached into a flower and created a global industry. Now another hand reaches for vanilla on a supermarket shelf. Between those two hands lies a history of knowledge taken, labor repeated, chemistry industrialized, and value distributed unevenly across the world. The next time vanilla tastes simple, remember that simplicity was never part of the orchid. It was manufactured by moving the difficult parts somewhere else.